and welcome to everyone. I am honored to be here this evening, partly because I have the distinct privilege of being able to talk to these two wonderful people tonight. One I know well, and the other I know through reputation. And the first, Mike Africa Jr., has become my friend. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. Mike Africa Jr. is an activist, a writer, and the host of the podcast On a Move with Mike Africa Jr. He is the star of the HBO Max documentary, 40 Years a Prisoner. He is a stage performer, a keynote speaker, and a hip hop artist. Mike was born in Philadelphia in a Philadelphia jail following a police raid on his parents' home that led to their arrest and sentence to 100 years in prison. At age 6, he witnessed the smoke in the air from a police bomb that was dropped on his family's home, killing his uncle, his cousin, and 9 other family members. At 13, he began working to free his parents from prison. After over 25 years of struggle, with the help of his family and attorney Brad Thompson, Mike got his parents out of prison when Mike was 40 years old. The second of our illustrious guests is Dr. Krystal Strong, who, as I said, I know by reputation through various folks down at the University of Pennsylvania. She is assistant professor of education and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And she is also, she also has affiliations in Africana studies and anthropology, and is a core organizer with Black Lives Matter Philly. As a scholar and organizer, her work focuses on youth and community activism, Pan-African social movement building, and the role of schools as sites of political struggle in Africa and the African diaspora. Her current projects investigate school protest and youth leadership in Africa, and community-led organizing work around education and the displacement of Black communities in Philadelphia, her hometown. With Mike Africa Jr., Dr. Strong is helping to build the Move Activist Archive, a counter archive of Move history and collective memory. So as we get started, I want to say thank you to both of you for your willingness to participate in this conversation. And as we get started, I just had a couple of contextualizing comments and then want to get right into our questions. I also wanted to note that Mike has an engagement that he has to attend. And so he's going to be with us until about 6:45. So we want to hear as much as we can from Mike before he has to leave. And I wanted everyone to know that. So if he suddenly disappears from the screen, you won't think he was just leaving us abruptly. May 13th, 2021 marked the 36th anniversary of the bombing of Move, which killed 11 members of the Black Liberation and Human Rights Organization, including 5 children. I think it is important to say their names: Conrad Africa, Delisha Africa, Frank Africa, Katricia or Tree Africa, Little Phil Africa, Raymond Africa, Rhonda Africa, Teresa Africa, Tommaso Africa, Zanetta Netta Africa, and the group's founder, John Africa. Only 2 people survived the intended massacre of the occupants of 6221 Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia, authorized by then Mayor W. Wilson Goode. Those 2 people were Ramona Africa and Birdie Africa. The bomb and resulting fire also destroyed 61 homes in the surrounding West Philadelphia neighborhood. This year's anniversary was marked also by the disclosure of additionally disturbing information. The remains of at least 2 of the bombing victims had been held by 2 Ivy League institutions and used for research purposes without the knowledge or consent of the victims' family members. For weeks after the May 13th anniversary, discussions proliferated about the unethical behavior of the city's leadership, both during the mid-1980s and now. Confusing information circulated as the public was told conflicting stories. Local news sources like the Philadelphia Inquirer and WHYY reported that Pennsylvania Health Commissioner Dr. Thomas Farley had ordered the cremation of the remains when he became aware of their existence in 2017, again, without consulting members of the MOVE organization. The following day, the public learned that the remains, in fact, still exist and were located in a, quote, refrigerated section of the medical examiner's office in a box labeled, quote, MOVE. Social media posts from members of the MOVE community and the mayor's office document painful revelations released to not only the MOVE community, but anyone interested in the ethical treatment of human beings, regardless of race or creed. Ultimately, Dr. Farley resigned, and the city's medical examiner, Dr. Sam Galino, was placed on administrative leave. After several public protests and exchanges with both Philadelphia city officials and Penn Museum administrators, members of MOVE were finally given the human remains on July 2nd, 2021. They have since been laid to rest in Bartram's Garden, a 50-acre public garden and National Historic Landmark in Southwest Philadelphia, situated on Lenape land. For many people gathered this evening, the story of MOVE begins in the 1980s. However, this is not the case, as the organization was founded in 1972 by John Africa-born Vincent Lepage. And as you heard in the introduction, he is Mike's uncle. The group also had a fraught relationship with Philadelphia city officials. In fact, I would argue that the 1985 bombing was a direct extension of earlier events involving MOVE and Philadelphia's law enforcement and city officials. So, Mike, I saw you put your camera on. You took your camera off. Are you able to get us started with some of the early history of MOVE? And you have to unmute.
Okay, cool.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about the early history of MOVE and your direct connection with some of its existing and former members. So if you could get us started that way, I would appreciate it.
Sure. And thank you for that beautiful opening. I really appreciate the respect that you showed to my family and to all of the victims of the bombing. And I just appreciate the way you just delivered that. Yeah, so the organization started and John Africa started the above ground chapter in the early 70s. The mission of MOVE has been quite confusing for a lot of people because there's been so much complex traumas and situations, right? But the mission, John Africa's belief, is to protect life. And the mission is to give other people information to protect life too. And when we say life, we're talking about people, animals, and the environment. And of course, we all know now that having the type of belief system that would compel you to protect life is not always comfortable for city officials and law enforcement when your belief is to protest against unjust institutions that abuse animals or poison the environment or lock up innocent people or give people unjust jail terms. And so MOVE, as a result of having this belief and protesting against these institutions, MOVE came under attack very early on too. I think a lot of the reasons that people didn't understand MOVE is because they were spending a lot of time trying to figure out what these dreadlock people were, right? Dreadlocks are popular in 2022, but I can assure you that in 1970, whatever, they were not. They were not popular in 1980s. I think they started beginning to get popular probably in the mid to late 90s. Whoopi Goldberg and Jumpin' Jack Flash wasn't happening. and neither was Bob Marley in the way that people recognize him now. So people spent a lot of time trying to figure out this. And then that just led to other incidents. Frank Rizzo was a very brutal and racist police commissioner and mayor, and he targeted MOVE because MOVE was Black and radical and ... So that's kind of the beginning.
Thank you. That you touched on several things that I think I want us to come back to. I think one of the things that I do want to highlight is the way that you talk about that John Africa's original intention for the organization was about the protection of life, people, animals, and the environment. And when you couple that along with, let's say, the, I'm going to call it the natural hair movement, which is what we call it now, right? You're absolutely right. Like the whole emphasis, the image, it was very foreign to people in the 1970s and in the 1980s. So that early, thank you for that early history. I want to pull you in, Krystal, because I want to talk a little bit about your background. And then, Mike, I'm going to come back because everybody doesn't know your origin story. And so I want to pull Krystal in, and then I want to come back to you. Okay, so Krystal, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ever began working with Mike, or whatever drew you to being interested in MOVE?
Sure. So it's really an honor to be here. Organizing with Mike has just been one of the joys of my life. And so it's, always good to be with my good bro here. I'll say that, the connection between me and MOVE formed through organizing work, right? And with Mike, it was kind of a bridge between both organizing work and some of my scholarly work. So I'm from Philly. That's another point of connection. And most of my sort of intellectual work up until that point had been around youth organizing and activism in Nigeria, right? However, when I came back home to Philadelphia after finishing my PhD in California at Berkeley and starting this job at Penn, I was very much kind of trying to figure out my place in organizing work in the city once again. And so the very first, I've been involved in organizing work since I was a college student, but it's taken me in many different directions. And so when I came home, my first thought, apart from the kind of academic professional trajectory, was, where do I want to do my organizing work? And so I'll never forget the very first event that I went to after moving home was a MOVE event, or actually it was an event for Mumia. It was a campaign to bring Mumia home event. And anybody who knows anything about the campaign knows of the connection between MOVE and Mumia. And so, at that event, it's kind of stunning to think about it now. There was this elder who had all of these newspapers that they had just so lovingly preserved. And I was just like really intrigued by this elder who's not an archivist, who is a community member, who had collected all of these newspapers over the years that they had displayed at this organizing event. And so that kind of got me on a path to thinking about community preservation work, archiving Black Philadelphia. And that sort of began to form a project called Remember Black Philadelphia Now, which is a digital storytelling and community archiving project. And so because I started to do some work around preserving Black Philly, collecting oral histories, I'm not a historian, I'm an anthropologist by training, but I'm also a Black person who cares about Black Philadelphia and what is happening and how our communities are shifting. And so anyway, in 2018, Mike and I, of course, nobody who is interested in organizing Philadelphia doesn't know about MOVE. Nobody who is aware of Philadelphia history doesn't know about MOVE. And so I had this awareness of MOVE, but not like the personal connections. And so in 2018, through some mutual friends and comrades of ours, Sheena and Christina, Mike and I started working on a Black resistance tour of Philadelphia as part of the American Sociological Association conference. And so they brought me into that project, which was a part of this annual conference because they knew I was doing this Black Philly work. And so we literally planned a tour of Philly on a school bus that involved kind of sites of Black resistance. We started downtown. We went to the Powelton Village site. We went to Osage Avenue. We took people around to Mosque 12 in West Philly. We went to the Church of the Advocate. It was a really wonderful experience. And so it was kind of at that point that my relationship with Mike started to form. And Mike had started talking about wanting to archive MOVE history because his mom had just come home in 2018, which was like this beautiful whirlwind. His dad would come home a few months later. I'm sure Mike will talk about this more. Long story short, actually, I've already made a short story long, but I'll bring it to a close right here and say that after 2020, Mike and I really began to deepen our organizing relationship. Me from BLM Philly, Mike with MOVE, we formed together with other Black radical organizations, the Black Philly Radical Collective, and did some incredible organizing work, including this amazing action on Osage Avenue. You know, we were at the time as a city, as a nation, as the world, really grappling with George Floyd's murder and what that means around policing and Black life. And so as organizers in Philly, we said, you know, we don't have to look to Minneapolis for this. We have to reckon with MOVE's history. So we organized this beautiful action in June of just a couple of weeks after George Floyd's murder. There must have been thousands of people we took over Cobbs Creek. We went from Cobbs Creek all the way to Malcolm X Park. It was such an incredible life moment. And so from there, we started sort of talking about how to really do this MOVE archive work more seriously. And I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about what that looked like. But the point I'm trying to make here is it was just very organic connection through organizing, through our interest in sort of preserving Black Philadelphia histories. And here we are.
Thank you for, I think we needed to hear everything that you had to say because I love the kind of the organic, which is the way, you know, I think about even my own connection to Mike and Debbie and Mike Jr. It's all been organic. So for those who are joining us today, my connection to all of this is that Michael Sr., while he was at Graterford Prison, while he was serving out his part of his 40 years, got his degree through Villanova University's Graterford program. And when he was released from prison shortly after Debbie got home first, and then he came, one of his professors, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, Joseph Betts, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Villanova, he wanted to host Senior and Debbie at Villanova and invited a few people to meet them. And I had the good fortune that I was invited. And so I got to meet Junior as well, and I got to meet Senior and Debbie. But then as a part of that meeting, I found out that Junior has a long-standing relationship with my brother, who is the theater director, Ozzie Jones, and they had done work together. And so that kind of organic thing, you know, it absolutely, it means something. And over the course of time, we have developed a very wonderful, close relationship. And I'm very proud to say that I performed the wedding ceremony for Senior and Debbie. And so that's like my connection. And I agree with you, Krystal. This kind of work that I have been doing with the family is one of the privileges of my life. And I I don't think that I can say that any stronger. I want to go back to something that you said. One of the places, one of the sites on the Black Resistance Tour is the Powelton Avenue site. And Mike, I want to go back because that's, in many ways, that's your origin story, right? Mom was pregnant at Powelton Village. You were there. You might not could see everything that was going on, but you were there. And so can you tell people about that? I think it's special. It's heartbreaking and special that that Powelton Avenue site is there. And everybody doesn't know about Powelton Avenue. As I started, I said, people think MOVE starts with 1980, but in fact, it doesn't. So can you tell us something about that site and about why it's significant?
I can, but before I do, I just got to reiterate, this is a very beautiful discussion we're having right now. I really appreciate it, the way it's flowing, and the crystals are just shining. Shining.
We need to go on tour, Krystal, as the crystals. I love it.
Yeah, so Powelton, August 8th, 1978, when I spoke about the attacks on my family and Rizzo, Frank Rizzo was the mayor at the time, and he was very Donald Trumpish. And, you know, he sent his police to attack MOVE because there was an eviction notice that had to be delivered. And hundreds of cops, I guess he felt hundreds of cops were needed to make that delivery. So when the police got there and MOVE would not leave their home, the police the fire department started to shoot water from the deluge hoses, and the streets department began knocking down the fence around the house with the bulldozer. They started picking at the house with a cherry picker and knocking through the windows. And then as all of this was happening, like the police with their deluge hoses. Now, a lot of people may not recognize the power of a deluge hose, but those fire cannons from those firemen are very powerful. They're powerful enough to dislodge large foundation stones from buildings, and they can create a collapse. And there were 4 of them trained on MOVE's house, while my mom and my dad and all the other MOVE members were inside. And during this initial assault, a shot was fired, and witnesses say that the shot came from another direction, not from MOVE, but it didn't stop the police from opening fire on MOVE. And hundreds of rounds of ammunition was shot at MOVE. And in the shooting, a police officer was shot and killed. And of course, the police blamed the shooting and killing on MOVE. My mother was included in that. And while she was in that basement trying to tread water and survive and hold her belly, and my her 2-year-old daughter at the time too, she was being already processed for prison. And the next day, the police, after the police arrested all of the people from the house, the next day's newspaper headline read, "Oh my God, they shot a cop." And shortly after that, maybe about 5 weeks, my mother, who was still pregnant, but not for long, gave birth to me in her jail cell.
Thank you. Every time I hear that story, it sends chills down my back. I don't tire of hearing it, and I'm always amazed by the details of it. I'm wondering also about the Black Resistance Tour. I find it just an amazing endeavor. And can you tell me, and this can be for both of you, Krystal, I'll start with you and then I'll come back to you, Mike. Which sites are on the tour and why? Like, what were the types of sites that you were thinking about? What was sort of your controlling principle? Was it about a particular type of political resistance, or did it have to do specifically with, let's say, social justice, or like what were you all thinking about as you were picking the various sites, and sort of what are the farthest points of the tour? If I hope I'm not asking a question that's too technical, but like, does it sort of start somewhere in North Philadelphia and end somewhere in South Philly, or like, So Krystal, why don't you start us, and then Mike, why don't you pick up?
I was actually trying to see if I could find really quickly the itinerary because I would love to actually share a little more specifics if possible, because there was a lot of love that went into it. So if possible, could I maybe throw it to Mike first and then come back?
Sure. And here's the other thing, if you want to, Krystal, Andrina, I think we can do this. Is it possible to put maybe a link in the chat? Is that possible, so that people who may want to take the tour? Okay, so I'm getting a yes.
Yes.
So if you find it, Krystal, or when you find it, if you find a link, you can drop it in the chat, because you may have people who are attending tonight that eventually would like to. Is the tour still being given? Like, is this something that people can register for and they can?
We were going to continue the tour. We were actually planning another one, but COVID happened, and a lot of other things happened too, but it derailed our opportunities. But we definitely want to continue the tour. We should. I would love to do it and continue it and have it like a regular thing, because we started. I think the first stop was at the African American. Wait, no, was it the African American History Museum?
Mm-hmm.
And I found it.
You found it? Okay, good, because I can't remember exactly how.
So, and this sort of just speaks to the kind of beauty and serendipity of a lot of this, because when we were doing this work together, like we had just met each other, like in the process, we found out about his mom coming home. And so like his parents coming home, and shout out to Mike and Debbie, in case they're watching, two of my absolute favorite people in the world. But, as I imagine when we proceed in this conversation, like them coming home and the Move 9 being released created space for this kind of work to happen, right? But, this was meant to be like a one-time kind of workshop. When you organize, when conferences happen, there's usually ways you can propose kind of like extracurricular activities or workshops. And so two of our good folks and comrades are sociologists. And so they, I think, were working with Mike and then brought me into the process to kind of introduce sociologists to the real Philadelphia, right? And to Philadelphia's histories of resistance. I think something about the conference had to do with race. And it's like, you can't study race, you can't understand Black people if we're not talking about Black resistance, and if we're also not talking about Move. And so Move's story and Move's history was deeply, it provided the initial architecture. I think when I sort of came into the process, which was, I think, pretty early on, what had been sort of plotted out were these very important sites of Move history. So obviously Powelton Village, in the vicinity of 33rd and Powelton Ave, for those of you who don't know exactly the coordinates of what we're talking about. Of course, that involves Osage Avenue, 62nd and Osage, or, just right below Cobb's Creek, right? And so we were kind of thinking about how to build that out and to really create an experience. And so we started out because the museum was at the conference was at the convention center downtown. So we started out at the African American Museum. We sort of drove by there, and Mike was the tour guide. And right. We actually have this on film. We haven't released any stuff yet. We have this on film anyway. And then we go to City Hall. At the time, keep in mind, the Frank Rizzo statue was still there in 2018. And at the time, Move has had a historic, critique, obviously, of Frank Rizzo's role, but at the time there was a renewed campaign to take that statue down, led by Philly for Real Justice, but building on Move's earlier work. And so we drove by there, sort of talked about Frank Rizzo's significance to Move's story. They had just put up the Octavius Catto statue on the other side of City Hall. So we then went around there. And if we were to do the tour again, we would be able to do something new around City Hall, which is that there is now a mural that features Move members and some other organizers as well in place of...
Somebody named Krystal Strong.
I wasn't really going to dwell on that part, but I'm also featured on the mural alongside Pam Africa and Ramona Africa, which is just such a deep honor.
Yeah.
From there, we go up the Parkway to the Rocky statue. And as you all may know or may not know, depending on how familiar you are with Philadelphia, the Powhatan Village House is literally minutes away from the Art Museum, right? And so we cross the Spring Garden Bridge and we come down and stop at the Powhatan Village site, which is now a luxury student apartment building, which I think is a very kind of important part of this as well in the conversation about displacement and how different Powhatan Village looks than what it looked like before. And so from there, we go past the Paul Robeson House, we pass Malcolm X Park, we're working our way deeper into West Philadelphia, and we are en route to Osage Avenue. And so we stop the bus on the 62nd Street side and walk collectively with a bus full of people down Osage Avenue. We stop at 6221, which at the time, and this just kind of speaks to, anyway, how spaces shift even in short periods of time. In 2018, it was boarded up. 6221 was boarded up. There was a kind of makeshift Move memorial there, indicating that this was the house where the bomb was dropped. And then we went to the historic marker, which had, I think that previous summer, been established through the activism of elementary school students at Jubilee, right? If we were to go back to that same location now, Osage Avenue is these luxury condos now. Some of them are. Right. And so from there, and I'll just speed through this, and Mike, you can jump in. We leave Cobbs Creek in Osage Avenue, the historic marker, and we kind of take folks towards Lancaster Avenue, and we pass by the original location of Mosque 12, where Malcolm X famously ministered for a period of time. We pass the Martin Luther King bust, which is at 40th in Lancaster, right? We then we're headed from west to kind of north, and we go past the John Coltrane House, which is at 33rd, and Cecil B. Moore, and then we head over to past the Black Panther Party headquarters, which are also on Cecil B. Moore, or previously Columbia Ave, the historic Columbia Ave riots, the iconic photo of the Black Panthers being stripped almost naked and harassed by the police. We passed the UNIA building, which is still there. And then we stop at the Church of the Advocate, which is such an important political institution historically and to this point. We take a tour of the Church of the Advocate. And then we, from there, went to Freedom Theater, which at the time, and still, is this historic Black theater performance space where I went as a child, I might add. But now, Freedom Theater's fate is hanging in the balance, like a lot of our historic Black cultural institutions. And so from there, from Freedom Theater, we moved to 11th and Vine. And this is kind of bringing in Mumia's history. There is a mural of Daniel Faulkner. We're sort of locating people within Mumia's story, and also Mumia's connection to Move, right? Part of the reason why he was targeted because of his journalism in support of Move, right? And also his, the fact that he was an activist and formerly a Black Panther, right? so anyway, that's the end of the tour. And I think Mike can, share more about how we've been thinking about reviving it,
So
pending
I
COVID.
there's two things that I want to say, and Mike, I'm watching the time for you because I want to make sure that you're okay for your next thing. One thing is I wanted to say that this sounds like this was an incredibly moving tour. I can't imagine that people were not visibly moved, right? As they were listening, I'm sure, Mike, to your explanation of these places, but then just to be a person who's connecting the dots, right? Putting all of this together. So Mike, I wanted to invite you to add anything you wanted, but then I want to get your take on the question that we have on the table. Because I'm thinking about how all of what Krystal just said, right? And all the work that you all have done and bridging it back to the MOVE bombing. Do you look back at it and see it as a turning point or as a reference point? And you can interpret my question however you want to, but I'm really wondering, is it like, do you see sort of significant changes from that moment? Or is it just something we can keep referencing back to?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's probably both, right? I mean, on the one hand, it was definitely a turning point, but it's definitely a reference point too. When we were on the tour, one of the things, I think the name of the tour was Feeling Race and Injustice in Philadelphia. And one of the points that we were making while I was tour guiding was that there's a Rocky statue in Philadelphia that Rizzo pushed to have come here. The movie Rocky is so iconic in Philadelphia. And while there is this praise for Rocky, and every year thousands and thousands of people visit the Rocky statue. Now they're calling the art museum the Rocky Steps, right, for this fictional character. But there's fighters from Philadelphia that they don't talk about. Black fighters, Joe Frazier. It took Joe Frazier 50 years to get a statue here. And he beat Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time. Bernard Hopkins was the light heavyweight champion at the age of 50. Most fighters retire at the age of 32. He was the light heavyweight champion at the age of 50. And there's no statue for him. So that was like one of the points that we wanted to drive home in this tour, that Philadelphia has a rich history in extreme racism. And I think that when you look at May 13th, you see it clearly. You see it clearly. I wonder if Frank Rizzo would have taken that helicopter and flew it over the South Philly residences and dropped the bomb on 11 Italian kids, 11 Italian people, right? So I think May 13th was definitely a pivotal moment too, because I think people, it took a while, but there was a different level of respect. And I think when people really look into what MOVE is about and what John Africa started the organization for, that bombing makes people dig deeper. Like, you don't drop a bomb on people because they're a nuisance to a neighborhood. And since when have Black people's voice been ever catered to when it comes to government anyway? We've been complaining about slavery since slavery, and they didn't care about that complaint, right? So to go to the extreme of dropping a bomb so it makes people look deeper. And then when people understand that John Africa was talking about life and freeing the air, and what you see the brothers and sisters doing at fighting against the Keystone Pipeline, and what you see the people doing and fighting against the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus, taking animals from putting animals in cages, taking tigers from the rich jungles of India and putting them in a cage where they're forced to live their natural life or forced to jump through rings of fire, right? So once people started digging deeper and seeing that message, then it makes sense. And people were much more attracted to MOVE. And then when they got to meet us and see us for who we really are, then it's like, wait, it just doesn't add up. But it shows the length that the government will go to try to stop people from opposing it and toppling it.
Thank you. That was a really sort of fulsome answer. I think you did a really nice job of kind of making the connection. And I like that you talk about how the bombing, like even the memory of the bombing, makes you stop and dig deeper, right? I wholeheartedly agree, right? And I like that you use the word pivotal as well, right? So we can talk about turning points, we can talk about pivots, we can talk about references. I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, Krystal. Mike, it is 6:45, so I want to be respectful of your time. And I feel like Marty Moscowane when she's got these people on what is her show? I can't think of her show, on NPR, and like people will come and then they'll have to leave. So I know that you have to leave us when you radio times, that's it. I know that you have to leave us when you do. So stay as long as you can and disconnect when you have to. And we know what's going on.
Yeah.
Your thoughts about if this is a turning point or a reference point, a pivotal point, however you want to characterize it.
I just wanted to ask, Mike, are you dipping out now?
I think so. I hate to.
Okay. I'm like, if we can squeeze a little bit more out of you, I don't want to stand in the way of that.
The people are standing at the door, they're looking at me like,
okay.
Are they? Well,
Yeah.
Mike, thank you. We are all virtually clapping for you. Thank you for spending the time with us. It's always a privilege. It's always a pleasure.
It's always a privilege for me too, and an honor. And it's always great. And the crystals are shining. And I wish I didn't have to go, but you're in good hands.
Thank you for giving us the time, Mike. And whatever I'm ready to do, I hope it's magnificent.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Peace, y'all. Here I come.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, Krystal, what do you think? How are you thinking about all of this? And then, of course, I've got other questions for you. So go ahead.
I really appreciate the way Mike set that up, and I kind of want to follow his lead on that because I felt some ambivalence when thinking about my response to the question, because on the one hand, I think we can look at May 13th, 1985 as a turning point, particularly when thinking about MOVE, because like with 78, MOVE's objectives, MOVE's strategy, MOVE's work, which was about protecting life, right? It shifts because of being targeted and murdered and politically imprisoned by the state, right? MOVE, before August 8th, 1978, was focused on building up the organization, the way they were living communally. There's so much there about MOVE's philosophy, stewardship of land, perspectives on food, perspectives on like how one sort of dresses and exists ethically in the world and in respect for the world. But all of that changes when so many of the members, we talk about the MOVE 9, but there were other people who were incarcerated for years, right? Because of August 8th, 1978. And so the organization's entire activity must reorient to, number one, focus on freeing people, right? And so what happens between 78 and 85 is all oriented around how do we pressure the system to release our family who are being unjustly, politically incarcerated, right? And then after this, the most heinous act of state violence that I think most of us have imagined or seen historically, in this fashion, right? Everything reorients again around justice for 11 people. Ramona is imprisoned after being attacked by the state, almost killed by the state, right? And so I think I'm kind of trying to pull out the way that these spectacular moments of state violence, but also the way that move was targeted for all of these years, it shifted, it reoriented the organization's intended trajectory and work, right? On the other side, and this is where I felt ambivalence about this, what has really changed since May 13th, 1985? Are Black children more safe from the threat of state violence? Are Black radicals, activists more safe from state violence? You know, one of our dear friends and comrades, Aunt Smith, who is a wonderful teacher, educator, community advocate, is facing felony charges for, you know, being present at the, you know, events of the 2020 uprisings, right? And so it's not as if the state, and this is one of many state and federal cases that are being sort of weaponized against people who participate in resistance. And so are we any more safe? You know, are Black people's lives any less imperiled by the police in the state? And so that's where I feel like this hasn't been a turning point. We haven't learned the lessons one might have imagined we would have learned. And it is indeed, as Mike said, a reference point, because we can't talk about policing, we can't talk about prison, we can't talk about Black people in Philadelphia without reference to what happened on May 13th, 1985. And, you know, before Mike and I started working on this Move Archive project, as part of this other project I mentioned called Remember Black Philly, we collected, through BLM Philly, we hosted a screening of The Bombing of Osage Avenue, which is a film that came out shortly after May 13th, 1985. It was directed by Louis Messiah, who runs Scribe Center. And Scribe Center, just to show the connections, helped Mike Africa Sr. and Debbie Africa produce and direct a film about their love story called By Your Side, which Mike Jr. and I were assistant directors for. So anyway, I'm sort of illustrating.
And I'll jump in. And my son orchestrated the film getting on the film circuit. So,
okay.
So my son is Caleb Lucky, if you've ever seen him work. And he got their film all on the film circuit. So, well.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Louis Messiah's mother was one of my French teachers, if you can believe.
Wow. You know, so I mean, I think we're kind of illustrating here all of these deep connections, but also references, like, you know, and so the point I was trying to make with that, which I think, you know, your interjection is like so beautifully sort of helping us to see, is that we cannot talk about these histories without reference to this moment. And, I remember where I was going, which is we did a screening of Bombing of Osage Avenue. This might have been in 2018, actually, May 2018. And we collected oral histories of anybody who had a connection or had a memory of May 13th, 1985. And we interviewed a woman who was in her 40s. She was in her 40s. I don't know. She wouldn't tell us exactly where she was in her 40s, but she was a child on May 13th, 1985. And she talked about how that was when she knew that the system couldn't be trusted, that the people, she made, there's this part in her oral history narrative where in the recording where she talks about how she learned in that moment that the people who I was told are there to protect us won't protect us. And that has shaped someone who didn't know Move, was a Philadelphian, but coming up in this moment, right? And so there are countless stories like that.
You know, your answer it gets at the heart of my question, right? And it's the reason that I posed it to you, because even as I was preparing for this evening's conversation, I was thinking so much of what you were just articulating. I was thinking, well, yeah, on the one hand, it does become a kind of reference point for us, for those of us in Philadelphia,
folks who are interested in Black resistance, whether we are thinking about Philadelphia history or 20th century African-American history, right? It is this really important moment. But then as I was preparing, I thought to myself, but yeah, some things have changed, but then there are other things that haven't. And it just made me kind of stop. And I think you have beautifully articulated almost a kind of fulcrum, right? Like this kind of, what we have going on here, right? On the one hand, but on the other hand, we can't ignore these things. So I have one quick question, and then I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn to some of our questions from the audience. Those oral histories, are they a part of the larger archival project? I'm assuming they weren't necessarily envisioned initially, but I'm assuming that they are going to be a part of it. And as sort of a second part of that question, is the archive both like sort of digital, like these oral histories, and like the preservation of these newspaper clippings, and like sort of what does the archive, how is it comprised?
Sure. So there's, and again, this is like the organic thing that we keep coming back to. So when we did that sort of oral history collection, we actually interviewed Mike as well, not knowing that like eventually 3 years later or 2 years later, we would actually start a collaboration around the MOVE archiving project. That was a project that was about Black Philadelphia and thinking about these sort of important moments, historical legacies for Black people in the city of Philadelphia. It wasn't specific to MOVE. We'd also gone to Odunde and collected oral histories at Odunde, which, if you're not familiar with, it's one of my favorite Philadelphia traditions. It's the largest African street festival in North America. I believe that's what, how Odunde describes itself, right? And so, and we also did things like street interviews with people about different parts of the city. So it was a very sort of broad storytelling archiving project. And so that was happening over here with me. But then unbeknownst to me, in, I want to say 2018, Mike's aunt, Louise James, passed away. And for those of you who don't know Louise James, or you might know Louise James, but not know who Louise James is, she was the owner of the Osage Avenue house. She tragically lost her son, Frank, in the 1985 bombing. She was an original MOVE member, although by the time of 1985, she had left the MOVE organization. But at the same time, she was a minister of information for MOVE. And so after 85, she and her sister, Mike's grandma, Laverne Sims, Debbie's mother, become MOVE archivists. They didn't, I don't know that they thought of themselves as MOVE archivists, but they were writing columns. They were putting, keeping the story of what happened to MOVE alive in the Black press, in the national press. They were doing public appearances to commemorate what happened on 1985. They were also trying to get people free, including their family members, right? And so archive work becomes a political strategy and a form of political organizing, not for the purpose of posterity necessarily, but the immediate needs of how do we figure out how to get our folks free? How do we figure out how to honor the lives that the state has taken from us? Louise James was a fiery woman who, if you watch the commission hearings, she is the woman with the fro who is going in so articulately about what happened on May 13th, 1985. So if you've seen any of those iconic clips, you've probably seen Louise James. But anyway, what I'm getting to is that when she passed away, and she lived in what is now called University City in the 40s around, I think, like Chestnut Street in an apartment building, her entire apartment is filled with all of these documents, these legal documents, prison letters, columns, speeches, published and unpublished writings, recordings, so many recordings of MOVE speeches, MOVE events, both audio recordings, video recordings. So this incredible archive that she and her sister have built that is a form of both love, but also resistance to what is happening to MOVE. And so when she passes away, Mike is able to steward these materials. And so Mike is like a jack of all trades, and he's always thinking about how to further MOVE's mission, but also to honor the lives of MOVE members and their legacy, and to educate people about MOVE's truest philosophies and perspectives that have, as I mentioned earlier, have really been lost because of what the state did to MOVE, right? And so anyway, the MOVE archive starts, it's literally, Mike has been kind of bequeathed this legacy of archive work. He's told me stories about how his aunt would try to kind of cajole him into helping her archival practice, because also within the archive I haven't mentioned is all of these annotated clippings of mainstream news stories in the press about MOVE. And so you see her clip these stories about MOVE, arrange them, annotate them, highlight them. And so he did some of that work as a child. And so in many ways, the MOVE archive is an inheritance, and we are following in the footsteps of these incredible Black mothers who used archive work and preservation as a political tool, as an act of love.
Your answer is just, you just are giving us so much wonderful information. Mike and I have talked about his aunt's legacy. I've done some of my own research and have found online over 100 of her published columns. And I didn't even realize how prolific she was, how much writing.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, like we're seeing in her, and she, we're seeing her like copies, 100 copies of a column that she's mailing out, right?
Yeah.
Or we're seeing drafts of columns as they're being developed, right? Or we're seeing these handwritten, it's just incredible. And in fact, this past summer, we really started working with the archive materials. We started kind of going through the materials with Mike Sr., actually, in many moments, and just trying to make sense of what is there, to understand what is there. And I can't describe just when you're touching these documents, when you're seeing the annotations, when you're seeing the drafts as they form and change, it's such, more than anything, more than like the how unique this is, because right now, most things that people have access to related to MOVE in terms of the historical record is a state archive, right? Yes. At yes. Temple University. Yes. So MOVE, MOVE's own, like this is not visible to most people. And so apart from what is very special about this, and there are other archive sources as well, because MOVE members did this as part of how they were envisioning to free their family, right? Apart from that, I can't describe how moving it is to see in these artifacts the love and care and commitment over decades, like literally decades. We saw things from the early 70s we saw things from the 2010s. We saw letters to presidents, to government officials, letters to back and forth to people, MOVE members who are incarcerated. So the vastness of the love and the labor is remarkable.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about two things. One is sort of the art of curation, right? It's amazing. In some ways I keep thinking the word that keeps coming to me is bridge, right? That this work serves as a kind of bridge from the past to the present, into the future, right? Even about how we think about resistance, how we think about Black self-efficacy, how we think about Black families. I think exactly right when you use the word love, right? That when you think about MOVE and you think about the way that MOVE has been depicted and the way that the history has been told, part of the work that you're doing is literally that you're changing the narrative, and that you are really helping the city, and anyone else who has access to this information will have access to this, eventually this entirely digitized archive that, I have to say, and I'm sure you already feel this way, it's a lifetime worth of work, right? Like your entire career could just, turn to this work because there's so much and there is so much to do. But what it does is it allows us to sort of think about this in very different ways than we have been told this story. So I, just thank you for the work also, but even for your way that you have been explaining this to us. I think it has been really accessible and sort of bringing us along on this journey. I want to turn, if I might, to a few of the questions that people have put in the chat, or in the Q&A, which I greatly appreciate. One question is asked about that when Mike said that there was an above ground movement started in the 70s, does this mean that there was an underground movement, and how long was this movement in existence? And I don't know if you can answer that question, Krystal, but I'll turn it to you.
So I can't exactly answer that question, but I will direct you to what I think would be a great place to look for the answers. I don't think Mike was trying to accentuate like above versus underground when he said that. The stories I've been told about MOVE's kind of the history of MOVE, it starts in the 70s, right? And go, so I'm not aware of like a prior moment that is kind of underground in the 60s, for example. Although both in Louise James's book, she has a book that you can access called, it used to be on my desk.
Oh, I'm sitting here looking because I have
it's called John Africa, Childhood Untold Until Today, sort of tells her version of it. And in fact, in the archive, we see an earlier manuscript version of this, which is pretty incredible to see the distinctions. But that's the title of Louise James' kind of articulation of her brother's life. Yes. But then Mike last year reissued 50 Years on a Move, which is a book of, there was a previous version called 25 Years on a Move, which is MOVE's own sort of narration of its organizational history. And so Mike updated that last year on his website, which I think is mikeafricajr.com. You can actually purchase. I encourage you to purchase a copy of 50 Years on the Move because it provides some answers on MOVE's history from MOVE's own perspective.
And this year, 22, marks the 50th anniversary.
Right, exactly. This is 2022 is actually the 50th anniversary of MOVE as an organization.
So another person has asked, thank you for that answer. Another person has asked the question, if you think that the bombing could have happened in another city? Or do you think the atmosphere and conditions were so unique to Philadelphia that it could have only happened here?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I don't even know if you have an answer for it, but I think it's an interesting question.
Well, I do think, I mean, my immediate response, it's hard. I don't think we can really answer that question, right? Because it did happen here and it hasn't, you know, we can think about Tulsa, Oklahoma as another moment in which a Black community is besieged by a bomb, you know, airstrike, a domestic airstrike, right? But to my knowledge, apart from that, you know, I can't think of another such event. And I think, you know, even if we just sort of focus on 1985 in Philadelphia, and in fact, 50 Years on a Move sort of has a really beautiful, important analysis of how we get to 1985, right? When Mike's talking about Frank Rizzo's tenure and Frank Rizzo was not a singular figure, but he was a particular political figure that, we're talking about a majority Black city at the time, is still a historically Black city in the present moment. We're talking about a set of decisions to engage with Black people through militarized policing in a particular way. You know, when we think about the Black Panthers, for example, in that sort of moment of the strip search, right? We think about 1967 and Frank Rizzo's decision to sick police officers on school children who are striking, right? And so we're talking about a very particular culture of meeting Black people who are resisting with violence, with militarized police violence, which is very much a Philadelphia story. But then on top of that, the antagonisms between MOVE and the police, we see resonances of that with Black Panther Party and in its various chapters. I mean, we can look to other organizations in this kind of broad historic period that are confronting the police. They are confronting the state, right? They see themselves as having the right to do so, right? But, you know, we also have to look at this kind of like continued confrontationalism between MOVE. Before we get to 78, there are minor confrontations. 78 happens. Now we have 9 people convicted to 100-year sentences, and we have the people who are outside who are trying to work to free them in a very desperate situation, right? It's an antagonistic situation that is very specific. And so I'm sort of thinking of all of these things in tandem, because while there are similar kinds of conditions in other places, similar organizations that experienced absurd levels of state repression of this era, but that combined with the local dynamics of race, of policing, of kind of like authoritarian fascist rule on the part of the local government, those are very that's a very specific intersection.
Yeah, and it almost seems like that what happens in Philadelphia politics in the 1970s, there is a kind of, I don't know, it's like a sort of a convergence of several factors that creates the conditions for a particular kind of storm, right? A particular kind of thing that happens.
And the Black mayor is also a part of that.
Yeah, in the 80s, exactly.
Yeah.
I have two other questions from guests, and then I have a question. We have about 15 minutes, and I think we can do this at that time. So we have another question that says that the person says that they've heard us talk about the organization as MOVE, but they've heard it referred to as the MOVE. Now, I have never heard that, so I can't say all I have ever heard it is called Move. And that when you, let's say if you go on Move's website, also Move makes a point of saying that it is not an acronym, right? It is the name. So I don't know, have you ever heard it called the Move? Because I have not. I've always heard it referred to as Move.
The only time I've heard the article "the" is when it's being referred to in its full form, the Move organization.
Okay.
I've only heard the Move organization or Move.
Yes.
And, you know, as you sort of indicate, and this is one of the final parts of 50 Years on a Move that I love so much, Mike and his co-author are explaining that Move is not an acronym, that it's literally instructions to move.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And then, and the term "on a move," right?
Right.
Members talk about that that's what they're doing, right? That
Exactly.
they're keeping it moving, right? That they're
Exactly.
Constantly on a move. A follow-up to that question is about the person asked, what do you know about how, if at all, the history of Move is taught in the Philadelphia School District's required African American history course? And so do you know how it is taught? Do you like how it is taught? Do you think that there is a different way that it could be taught? And especially in this time when K-12 schools and teachers are being challenged and disciplined for talking about race and racism.
I love this question.
I do too.
And I actually do
and
have.
I will say it's coming from a teacher. It's coming from a professor of education. So
That's great, because I'm also in a school of education. And so,
yes.
So the answer so I'll say this, to my knowledge, or actually I know that there is not a Move specific unit within the curriculum, which, I mean, for those of you who, I don't know what you are aware of, but the African American history requirement was literally the result of over 50 years of struggle. In 1967, with the Black student walkout, they were advocating for a Black history requirement, which didn't happen until like the 2000s, right? And so it is hugely important to Philadelphia radical history that, and this is the result of that. One, there isn't a unit on Move within the curriculum, although my sense is that history teachers do teach about Move, but there's not a dedicated curriculum. And the reason why I know this is because I happen to organize with educators through the Philadelphia Black History Collaborative. One of my incredible comrades in BLM Philly, who was also a part of the creation of BLM at Schools Week, Ishmael Geminiz. Since last year, we have been planning on actually creating a Move curriculum as part of this broad sort of archive work. And so that's how I know that it doesn't exist, because part of the work we're doing is to actually create a curriculum and have it be a unit within the curriculum.
So can I jump in and ask you a follow-up question that's coming from another person? And I think this is really relevant. The person says that I often think about how I grew up right outside of Philadelphia and would have never learned about Move if it weren't for my parents. And I'm thinking about what you're saying here about the development of a curriculum, right? That this is critical. And the person goes on to say, are there educational materials that you'd suggest appropriate for children or, excuse me, young people, so that the history is passed to the next generation? And I think it's a question, and it relates exactly to what you're talking about, right? The ultimate development of a curriculum. Are there materials that you've already thought about that you could put your fingers on, that you could, that we could make available on, let's say, the Lepage website, whatever, that people who want to know more information in a kind of digestible form for younger people that would be available?
So I'll say that there are Move materials that exist. To my knowledge, they're not currently sort of curated for age appropriate audiences. So when I think about like the films that we've mentioned, The Bombing of Osage Avenue, Let the Fire Burn, Mike and Debbie's film, By Your Side, which is not publicly available really yet. Mike's film, 40 Years a Prisoner, right? Like those have some really graphic material and challenging materials. And then there are, Louise James's book, 50 Years on a Move. There are other kind of narratives of move, right? I forget the book that has, there are several move books, right, as well, scholarly books. And so again, they're not really vetted yet for a child appropriate audience. And that is part of the work that we intend to do. And it's also part of the intended work of the Move Archive to make both these kind of digital artifacts available so you can actually review and use as a teaching tool some of these materials, but also to have age appropriate educational materials.
That makes a lot of sense.
Although I will say, one way I might sort of craft this, if I was an educator who wanted to do something now, is to talk about move through the Jubilee children. The Jubilee School, elementary school children who heard about move's history and were so disappointed to learn that there was no commemoration by the city of what happened to move on May 13th, 1985. So these elementary school children put in a historic marker application with the support of a teacher at the Jubilee School. And we now have the first public monument to move because of these children, right? And so I think, there's news stories about them. We often in our actions, Mike and I have organized many different actions, including actions around move. Last year on May 13th, 2021, we did a beautiful memorialization on Osage Avenue. We also did a teach-in in a live oral history interview after the issue with the Penn Museum and the remains. We did an action and we also did a teach-in. And you can actually view those online. Both of those events were live streamed. And I think they're archived on BLM Philly's YouTube page, but also Hate 5-6's, and I can drop the name in the chat. But what I am trying to get at there is, or actually the reason why I mentioned those is because we actually read the children's poetry about move that is available on the Jubilee website. So if you go to the Jubilee website or look up Jubilee and move, you actually can find some materials about what the children did. It's actually a really beautiful story within all of this.
That's actually a marvelous way to, in the absence of age-appropriate specific materials or curriculum that is already developed, that's a marvelous way to sort of find a way to teach about it, but to highlight the activism of children, right? And the compassion of children and the awareness of young people. So I have two more questions. One is quick. It might not be quick. I'll
be quick.
No, it's
I'll try.
Well, I'm thinking it may not be quick because it may have a long timeline. When and where will the Move archive become available? I almost hate to ask you that question because it may feel it may feel like pressure, but where are you with this?
So I'll say that we actually were really, we applied for and received a community archives grant from the Mellon Foundation, which is a 2-year grant to really build up the archive. And so unfortunately, COVID happened, or COVID is happening, I should say. But then, and this is kind of related to the turning point question, the assaults on Move have not stopped. And so our work was really compromised by how we had to respond to Penn Museum holding hostage the remains of Delisha in Tree Africa. And earlier you said, I meant to make a note of this before now, to my knowledge, Delisha's remains have not been repatriated because Penn is now denying that they ever had Delisha's remains, which we know to be true.
Didn't they? So
they returned remains. But if you are saying that you returned remains, but then you are also saying that you never had the remains of Delisha Africa, it's not clear to me. My understanding is that they may not have actually returned those remains. And so my point is that—
Meaning that they gave them something that may not have been her remains, so that when they had their ceremony, their memorial.
What I'm saying is that they have concluded that they only had the remains of Tree Africa. So what they returned were Tree's remains.
Oh, okay.
But so my point is that there is some contestation over whose remains were held. And so, and that's an ongoing contestation. And so I don't think we can say definitively that both sets of remains were returned.
I see.
And so, but this is kind of getting to my point, which is that we had to shift our focus to all of this, right? As opposed to the work we set out to do in 2020, right? And so anyway, part of what we're at the stage now where we are really organizing and cataloging this massive amount of material from Louise James. And this is not the only set of materials that we will be archiving. We're starting with Louise James's personal collection. And so what we're doing, we're working with Archivists for Black Lives, which is a collective of archivists in broadly, but we're working with a group that's in Philadelphia, and they're helping us to sort of come up with a protocol, catalog, get them in a better preservation condition, because these have been sort of in bins, trash bags, they were archivists, but not professional archivists. And so really getting the materials in a sustainable condition. And then from there, we've started digitizing some materials, but we haven't done, we've only done some. We have not done, I mean, we're in the low percentages of how far we've gone in that process because of what I described before. But after that, those stages, we already had a plan for engaging with the community and the public around the materials through performances. Mike didn't get a chance to talk about this, but he has a one-man show called Born on a Move, which is incredible. And it includes documents, archived, it's multimodal and really beautiful and moving. We, had planned for last year, literally we were going to have an entire weekend of activity where we were going to both celebrate this 50th anniversary, honor the significance of May 13th, 1985, but also collect oral histories, engage in this kind of public history process. But then we found out about Penn Museum and everything shifted. And so we're hoping that we can do that this year. But it's a long-term process, and we're expecting that this year, much later this year, at the end of this year into 2023, you'll see our digital footprint.
And it'll live, will there be a website?
There will be a website.
Okay.
Move will determine what of its own archive it will make available to the public, but the idea is to make this something that the community and public can engage with. There's also, when Mike came up with this idea, there was also an intention for there to be a physical space as well.
I see. Krystal, we are coming, or we have come to the end of our time. I feel like our time has flown by.
I see Elizabeth is coming back. I want to say thank you to you. First of all, for your eloquence tonight and your just your willingness to be so open and so generous with your time. But also, I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing, because in my work with Debbie and Michael Sr., I have literally felt like physically overwhelmed by the amount of work that has needed to be done. And to know that you are taking on such a Herculean task, right? I just want to say thank you. It is important. I am also a Philadelphian, and this means a great deal. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.